There is a hard truth about life in America that almost no one likes to say out loud. Being poor doesn't mean you spend less money. It often means you spend more. More for the same things. More for worse options. More for mistakes you didn't even choose to make. And if you've ever wondered why no matter how hard you work, money still feels like it slips through your fingers, this might be the reason nobody ever explained to you. Most people think poverty looks like laziness or bad decisions. That's the story that gets told. But the real story is quieter and much more uncomfortable. The real story is that when you don't have money, everything around you becomes more expensive. Not better, not easier, just heavier. Imagine waking up already behind. Not because you did something wrong, but because your bank account has no cushion, no room for error, no space for surprises. Every decision you make comes with pressure. Not pressure to choose the best option, but pressure to choose the option you can survive today. This is where the cycle begins. When you have money, you buy in bulk. You plan ahead. You wait for discounts. You invest in quality. But when you're poor, you don't get those choices. You buy small amounts because that's all you can afford right now. And small amounts always cost more over time. You buy the cheaper shoes because the better ones cost too much up front. The cheap shoes wear out faster. You replace them again and again. And before you realize it, you've spent more than the price of the good pair you couldn't afford in the first place. You buy the cheaper phone plan with hidden fees. You pay overdraft charges, late fees, convenience fees, penalties for being just a little late. Not because you don't care, but because your margin is thin. One delay turns into a charge. One mistake turns into a bill. This is what people don't understand. Poverty is expensive because it removes your ability to plan. In America, planning costs money. Even basic things like food follow this pattern. Healthier food is often more expensive. Cooking at home takes time, energy, and access to decent groceries. When you're working long hours, when you're exhausted, when you're stressed, cheap fast food feels like the only option. And over time, that choice costs more. In money, in health, in energy. Then there's housing. If you have money, you choose where you live. You think about safety, commute, long-term value. If you're poor, you take what you can get. Higher rent for smaller spaces. Old buildings with constant problems. Places that cost more because they're close to work, since moving farther away would mean transportation costs you can't afford. And that's where the next layer hits. Transportation. If you can't afford a reliable car, you pay in other ways. Repairs, missed work, ride shares, higher insurance, longer commutes, stress. If you rely on public transportation, you pay with time. Late buses, missed connections, fewer job options, less flexibility. And every delay has consequences. Being late once might not seem like a big deal, but being late when you're already struggling can cost you shifts, warnings, opportunities, and suddenly, poverty isn't just expensive, it's punishing. Now at healthcare, if you have money, you go to the doctor early. You prevent problems. You follow up. If you don't, you wait. You ignore symptoms. You hope things get better on their own. And when they don't, the problem is bigger. The bill is higher. The damage is worse. Emergency rooms are one of the most expensive ways to get care. Yet they're often the only option for people without savings or insurance. Not because they want to be there, but because waiting is cheaper until it's not. Debt works the same way. When you're poor, credit is more expensive. Interest rates are higher. Fees are harsher. Options are limited. You borrow not to grow, but to survive. To fix the car. To pay the bill. To keep going. And the cost of that borrowing follows you for years. This is how people get trapped. Not by one big failure, but by 1,000 small costs that keep stacking. Even time becomes expensive when you're poor. Time spent waiting, commuting, fixing problems, calling customer service, dealing with paperwork, fighting fees. Time you could have used to rest, learn, or plan a better future. Stress takes over, and stress changes how people think. When you're constantly worried about money, your brain focuses on the short term. What gets you through today? This week, this month, long-term thinking becomes a luxury. Not because you don't care about the future, but because the present is too loud. This is why advice often sounds useless to people who are struggling. Just save. Just invest. Just plan better. Those words assume you have room to breathe. They assume mistakes are affordable. They assume time is flexible. But poverty doesn't give you that space. In America, so many systems are designed around having money up front. Deposits, minimum balances, fees for falling below them, discounts for paying early, penalties for paying late, rewards for having more, punishment for having less. Even education follows this pattern. Better schools often require higher housing costs. Better opportunities often require unpaid time. Internships, training, certifications. Things are easier to access when you're not worried about paying rent. And slowly, quietly, the gap widens. People don't fall behind because they stop trying. They fall behind because the cost of catching up keeps increasing. What makes this even harder is the shame attached to being poor. People feel like they're failing at something everyone else seems to manage. So they don't talk about it. They don't ask for help. They hide the struggle. And that silence makes the problem feel personal instead of systemic. But if you step back and really look at it, you see the pattern. Being poor in America is expensive because the system assumes you're not. It assumes you can absorb surprises. It assumes you can wait. It assumes you can pay more now to save later. And when you can't, you pay extra for it. Not just in dollars, but in stress, health, and missed chances. This is only the surface. Because once you understand this, you start seeing how deep it goes. How it affects families, kids, generations. How growing up poor teaches you survival skills, but rarely gives you tools for stability. In the next part, we're going to go deeper into how this cycle keeps repeating. How fees, debt, and daily decisions quietly lock people into staying poor longer than they ever expected. What really keeps people poor in America isn't just low income. It's the way the system reacts to people who don't have money. The moment you fall behind, even a little, everything around you starts charging you for it. And those charges don't just take money. They take stability. Fees are one of the most invisible ways poverty becomes expensive. If you have money, fees barely touch you. You keep a balance in your account. You pay bills early. You avoid penalties without even trying. But when you're poor, fees show up everywhere. Overdraft fees, late fees, minimum balance fees, service fees, processing fees, fees for not having enough money to avoid fees. You miss a bill by a day, and suddenly the amount grows. Not because the service improved, but because you were late. You overdraft your account by a few dollars, and the bank charges you far more than the mistake itself. And once that happens, the next bill becomes harder to pay. One fee creates another problem. One problem creates another fee. This is how a small gap turns into a hole. And it doesn't stop at banks. Utility companies charge reconnect fees. Landlords charge late rent penalties. Phone companies add service charges. Insurance companies raise rates when payments are missed. Everything becomes more expensive the moment you struggle. And the worst part is, these systems are fast to punish and slow to forgive. Once your credit score takes a hit, the cost follows you everywhere. Higher interest rates, higher deposits, fewer options. You pay more for cars, housing, insurance, even phone plans. Not because you're riskier today, but because the system remembers yesterday. Debt becomes the bridge people use to survive this gap. Not luxury debt, survival debt. People use credit cards to pay for groceries, to keep the lights on, to fix a car so they don't lose their job. And when you borrow under pressure, you don't get good terms. You get high interest, low limits, harsh penalties, and debt under stress feels different. It's not about buying things you want. It's about avoiding consequences you can't afford. And that kind of debt creates constant mental noise. You're always calculating, always worried, always one step ahead of the next payment. This pressure changes how people live. When you're poor, you don't ask, what's the best choice? You ask, what's the cheapest right now? And those two answers are almost never the same. You skip preventive care because it costs money today. You deal with bigger problems later that cost more. You don't replace something when it starts failing. You wait until it breaks. You don't invest in education or training because you need income now. And years later, your options are still limited. This is how poverty taxes the future. Another cost people don't talk about is how expensive mistakes become when you're poor. If you have money, Mistakes are uncomfortable. If you don't, they're dangerous. A parking ticket, a missed court date, a paperwork error. These things snowball. Finas grow. Penalties add up. Warrants appear. Licenses get suspended. And suddenly, a small issue turns into a life-changing problem. And again, it's not about irresponsibility. It's about capacity. Managing systems takes time, energy, and mental space. When you're juggling multiple jobs, family responsibilities, and constant stress, small tasks get missed. Not because you don't care, but because you're overwhelmed. The system doesn't care why. Then there's employment. Poor people often have less stable jobs. Hourly work, unpredictable schedules, no paid time off, no flexibility. If something goes wrong, a sick day, a car problem, a childcare issue, income disappears immediately. And when income disappears, bills don't pause. This makes poverty feel like walking on a tightrope with no net. One wrong step, and the fall is immediate, and climbing back up costs even more. Housing is another place where being poor costs more. Security deposits, application fees, background checks, credit requirements. These costs block access to better housing. So people stay in places that cost more long-term. Older buildings, poor insulation, higher utilities, constant repairs, more stress. Moving to a better place requires money up front. And when you don't have it, you stay where you are, even if it's draining you. This is how people get stuck geographically. Food works the same way. Buying fresh ingredients requires time, storage, and access. Buying healthy food often costs more upfront. So people choose what fills them up, not what supports long-term health. And over time, health problems appear. Problems that cost money, time, and energy. Again, poverty isn't just expensive. It's exhausting. And exhaustion makes everything harder. It makes it harder to plan, harder to learn new skills, harder to advocate for yourself, harder to escape. This is why poverty lasts longer than people expect. Not because people stop trying, but because the cost of trying keeps rising. And there's a cruel irony here. The harder life gets, the more discipline it requires. Perfect timing, perfect decisions, perfect consistency. But perfection is hardest when you're under pressure. One slip, and the system punishes you harder than someone with money ever feels. This creates a quiet sense of hopelessness. People start believing that no matter what they do, they can't get ahead, that the game is rigged, that effort doesn't matter. And when people feel that way long enough, motivation fades. Not because they're lazy, but because constant loss teaches the brain to conserve energy. This is what people misunderstand when they judge poverty from the outside. They see outcomes, not conditions. They see debt, not desperation. They see missed payments, not impossible choices. They see stress, not systems. And until those systems are acknowledged, the cycle continues. But understanding this changes something important. It replaces shame with clarity. It helps people see that struggling isn't a personal failure. It's a predictable result of how costs, fees, and penalties stack against those with the least margin. And once you see that, you start asking deeper questions. Questions about fairness, about design, about why survival costs more than stability. In the final part, we're going to talk about how this cycle affects families and generations, how growing up poor shapes decisions for life, and most importantly, how awareness can create change even inside a system that feels stacked against you. Over time, the most damaging part of being poor in America isn't just the money you lose. It's the future you never quite reach. It's the version of life that always feels one step away. And for many people, that feeling starts early and follows them for decades. Growing up poor teaches you how to survive, but rarely how to build. You learn how to stretch things, how to make do, how to fix instead of replace, how to stay quiet when things are hard. Those skills are powerful, but they also shape how you see the world. You grow up learning that stability is fragile, that good moments don't last, that something always goes wrong. And when that mindset follows you into adulthood, it affects every decision. People who grew up poor often fear risk, even when risk could lead to growth. They choose safety over opportunity, not because they lack ambition, but because they've seen how fast things can fall apart. When you've lived without a safety net, you don't jump unless you're sure the ground won't disappear. This is one of the quiet ways poverty repeats itself. Parents want better lives for their kids, but when they're constantly stressed, exhausted, and stretched thin, they have less time and energy to guide long-term planning. Conversations become about bills, not dreams. About what can't be afforded, not what's possible. Kids absorb that. They learn early that money is stressful, that asking costs too much, that needs are a burden. And even when they grow up and start earning, that early conditioning doesn't disappear. It shows up as anxiety, as guilt for spending, as fear of enjoying money even when they finally have some. And again, this isn't a lack of intelligence. It's the weight of experience. Being poor also limits access to information, not because people aren't curious, but because learning takes time and mental space. When every day is about getting through, there's little room left to research investing, understand credit, or plan strategically. And the people who need that information the most are often the ones with the least access to it. This is how inequality becomes invisible. From the outside, it looks like different outcomes. But underneath, it's different starting points, different margins, different consequences for the same mistakes. One missed payment for someone with money is an inconvenience. One missed payment for someone without it can change everything. Over years, this creates exhaustion that people don't talk about. Not the kind that goes away with rest, but the kind that builds slowly. Decision fatigue, emotional burnout, a constant sense of being behind. And when people live like that long enough, they stop imagining a future that looks different from the present. They don't stop dreaming completely. They just dream smaller, safer, more realistic. And realism becomes a cage. This is why poverty is so hard to escape, even when income increases. Because habits, fears, and systems don't change overnight. Someone can earn more and still feel poor. Still feel one mistake away from disaster. Still avoid risks. Still carry the stress of years spent surviving. And unless that underlying pressure is acknowledged, money alone doesn't fix the damage. Another long-term cost people rarely mention is health. Chronic stress affects the body. Sleep suffers. Immune systems weaken. Mental health struggles grow quietly. Anxiety becomes normal. Depression hides behind productivity. And when health declines, costs increase even more. Missed work, medical bills, reduced energy. It's a feedback loop that's incredibly hard to break. And through all of this, society keeps sending the same message. If you're struggling, you didn't work hard enough. You didn't plan well enough. You didn't make the right choices. That message sticks. People internalize it. They blame themselves. They feel ashamed. And shame keeps people silent. Silence keeps systems unchallenged. But the truth is simpler and harder at the same time. Being poor in America is expensive because the system charges people for not having money. It rewards stability and punishes instability. It offers discounts for those who can pay early and penalties for those who can't. And once you fall behind, catching up costs more than most people realize. That doesn't mean change is impossible, but it does mean honesty is necessary. Real change starts when people stop pretending this is just about personal responsibility and start talking about structure, about access, about margin, about why survival costs more than comfort. And conversations like this matter more than people think. Because when someone hears their experience described out loud, something shifts. They feel seen. They feel understood. And understanding is the opposite of shame. If you've ever felt like no matter how careful you were, money still disappeared. If you've ever felt punished for small mistakes. If you've ever wondered why stability feels so hard to reach. You're not broken. You're navigating a system that makes being poor more expensive at every step. And the first step toward any real change is recognizing that truth. So before this video ends, I want to ask you something. If any part of this felt real to you, leave a comment. Share one experience. One moment where being poor cost you more than it should have. Not to complain, but to connect. Because someone else reading your comment will realize they're not alone. And if you know someone who's struggling, someone who works hard but still feels stuck, share this video with them. Not as advice, not as judgment, but as understanding. Because the most expensive thing about poverty isn't money. It's the silence around it. And the moment we start talking about it, that cost begins to drop.